Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin. This is my slow, book-by-book, author-by-author tour of my Penguin Classic wall. And we have started off in the classical world. It wasn't really my intent, and I've been sort of informally canvassing a lot of you to find out if maybe you would prefer it if I just bounce all around. If you would prefer it if I don't stick to the classical world, if I switch things up for the Daily Penguin for the whole course of the year. I don't know if I will or not, but right now we're still in the classical world. And this is another example. Today is another example of an author where I'm going to show you everything that I have by the author in Penguin Classic. It's not everything that Penguin Classic prints by any means, because this is not Propertius. This is not an example of an author from the ancient world whose textual provenance is so iffy that it's a miracle we have anything. This is the opposite end of that. This is an author who wrote his entire life, and we have almost all of it, in such good textual traditions that we don't really have to worry about it. And that author is the Roman orator and statesman Cicero. Cicero was a quote-unquote new man. He was not an established Roman family. He was from the provinces. But he had two things in his favor. In terms of the ceaseless, white-hot ambition that animated him for his entire life. The first of those was native ability. He was brilliant. He was a brilliant orator. He was a brilliant writer. He was a brilliant wielder of the Latin language. Oh, my God. Probably there's been no one better, that we know of anyway. That was the first thing, that he had native ability, and it became obvious to anyone who had any kind of official dealing with him as one of those things you couldn't really ignore. It was rare enough so that people who noticed it weren't content to send it back to Arpinium. they wanted to make some use out of it, and Cicero wanted it to be made use out of. And the other thing that was going in his favor was a connection with another new man, with Pompey the Great, who later self-named Pompey the Great. And they were from connected family histories. They were from connected family pasts. They were both new men, both of whom had kind of on-again, off-again contentious relationship with the established power, the established aristocratic families of Rome itself. And as Pompey's star rose, he helped Cicero and Cicero's brother. He helped them both. He helped their stars to rise. And sooner than you would have thought possible, in fact, it shouldn't have been possible at all, but eventually Cicero became a consul. He became basically co-president of the Roman Republic. And before then, it had lots and lots of the cursus honorum, the course of increasingly powerful public positions. And through it all, he wrote. He wrote constantly. He wrote right up until the end, when he, like so many other people, was caught up in the convulsion that was brought on the Roman Republic by Julius Caesar, who wanted to take it over and make it his property, become king, become God Emperor. Lie about it the whole time, but become God Emperor, become the one sole authority anywhere in the Roman world. So no more elected representatives, no more tribal elections, no more anything like that, just a boss, a godfather. Cicero was caught up in that convulsion, because when Caesar led his troops onto Roman soil, onto Italian soil, the government back in Rome knew that if the tradition of not doing that didn't stop him, then nothing else was going to stop him, so they were prime targets. They threw all of their hopes on Pompey the Great, this great military leader. They threw all their hopes on him to deal with this, to somehow save the Republic. And Pompey, of course, famously didn't, and Cicero had to flee. The government fled from Rome, and Cicero came to a sordid and grotesque end. Just had his head lopped off and displayed. It was not just beheaded, but his head was made into a display by the vindictive sister of one of the people who hated him in his life, who, legend has it, stuck her long hairpins in his tongue, so that his severed head was put on display in the rostrum of the Senate with pins sticking out of it and eyeballs up in the head. Grotesque way for a man of state and dignity to end. It was the risk you run. It was the risk you ran in the Roman world that was inaugurated by Marius and Sulla, and then brought to murderous mobster proficiency by Julius Caesar. But before that horrible moment, Cicero had had a checkered past in Roman government. He was a trial attorney. He was a famous trial attorney, a famous lawyer, famous advocate. And also when he was in government was famously histrionic, sometimes to murky results at best. There's a thing called the Catiline Rebellion. I won't go into the long details of it here, but Cicero played a major part, and forever afterwards, from the moment that the crisis came and forever afterwards for the rest of his life, spun what we would now call his own PR on the subject and on how he had saved the Republic. A dispassionate and cold reading of the facts can yield a very different opinion of what happened with the Catiline Rebellion, but one way or another. In between all of these things, nominal service leading in military service, all of the different rungs of the social ladder in Rome, being turfed out of office after being consul, being in sort of unofficial exile and in ill repute with the powers that be in the government. So forced to retire to his villa. In all of those cases, in the downtime from all of those events, Cicero wrote constantly. And we have, therefore, a huge amount of his writing. And I have a huge amount because Penguin Classics went straight to him. There's a whole shelf of Penguin Cicero that you can buy, especially if, like me, you end up having a mixture of older mass market editions and the newer editions that Penguin is continually doing. And I encourage that. As you could probably tell from my comments so far, I am not Cicero's biggest fan at all. I'm not Julius Caesar's biggest fan. I'm not Cicero's biggest fan either. And I'm not sure, had their positions been reversed, that Cicero wouldn't have done the same thing that Julius Caesar did. In both of them, I detect an absolutely adamantine self-interest. And that's always off-putting to me, whether it's Julius Caesar or Cicero or Napoleon Bonaparte. No matter who it is, it always bothers me when I see that in history or when I see it in real life. Not self-interest, of course. Self-interest is necessary. Some degree of self-interest is necessary. Some amount of it is a normal part of the human makeup. I mean adamantine self-interest, where the only thing you ever think about is what can benefit you. And I know that's not Cicero's reputation. His reputation for centuries, for millennia, has been as a disinterested statesman, someone who is willing to espouse the truth for his whole life and then die for it. I don't think, again, that a dispassionate viewing of the facts, of what we know, the period that we're talking about here, the 40 years that describes the transition from the Republic to the Empire, is unbelievably well documented. It is possible, therefore, to look at any subject connected with that transformation, whether it be the rise of Julius Caesar, whether it be the nature of life in the provinces, whether it be the career of Cicero. It's possible to look at any one of those subjects and actually take out the main source for that subject, in this case Cicero. It's possible to take out that vast body of writing that he has and still reconstruct what happened. And when you do that, it doesn't always square with Cicero's own version of events. But when he had those downtimes of writing, he changed what he did. He varied up what he wrote, and it shows in the literary relics that we have from him. And I want to show you a bunch of them in the Penguin Classic line, and I want to arrange them in ascending order of interest to you, especially if you've never read Cicero. Now, keep in mind, I want to stress this again. In dealing with these classics of ancient Greece and Rome, we are talking about translation a lot. And so I want you to bear in mind that even when we're talking about great classicists here like Shackleton Bailey or who else, you're far way off in these great Penguin Classics with their great introductions, their great critical notes. You are far way off from Cicero. Further from Cicero than you would be from almost any other author of the ancient world. We just talked about Ovid. And I alluded in that video that Ovid's versifying is bewilderingly complex. It's a bewilderingly brilliant use of Latin. That is a very different language from English, and therefore, if you're writing a pipe cleaning manual, then that'll come forward pretty well. But if you're writing as brilliant as Ovid did in verse, or as Virgil did in verse, you can expect that those authors will be zeroing in specifically on the strengths and uniquenesses of the Latin language, and those are the hardest things to translate. The same is true for Cicero, very much so. He is Ovidian in his level of genius at writing Latin, at writing prose. It's just unbelievable what he can do. And all of it comes from his skill at using the Latin language, which is not sequence-based like English. In an English sentence, the sequence of words makes a big difference. It will change the sentence. If you change the sequence in a lot of instances, it will change the sentence. Like, for instance, if I change that to say if you change the sentence, you change the sequence, that isn't true. So changing the sequence of words in an English language sentence means a lot. It makes a big difference. Whereas with Latin, one of the many differences is that Latin words come with their own operating instructions. Each Latin word can be plugged into the sentence anywhere because it is conjugated in such a way that you know what it's doing in the sentence. Or do you? There are ways to fudge that, and there are ways to position certain words in a long Latin sense, a very long Latin sense, a whole page, so that you are constantly playing with the reader's expectation of what the payoff words are going to be, the payoff word usually being the verb at the end, but also a couple of other things that could show up at the end. And while you're modulating the sentence up and down, phrase by phrase, clause by clause, you can be playing, if you're skillful, you can be playing with the reader's expectation of what is coming. You can be shading their reception of the rest of the sentence by the use of those words early on. Now, a variation of that can be done with English, but only a pale variation. You can't just wreck the word order of an English sentence, or you'll be writing gibberish. And there's no way to convey that fully in an English language translation, no matter how good you are. There is no way to convey that fully. I hate to say that, and part of me thinks that even at this late date of looking at millions of translations of Latin authors, a part of me still thinks it isn't true, that maybe just the right person hasn't tried it. But one way or another, it bears keeping in mind that although you have more Cicero than almost any other ancient Roman author, you also in a way have less Cicero in the Penguin Classic line or in any other line, because you're getting the gist of what he wrote, but what he wrote was not just gist. But anyway, I want to show you some examples of the least interesting stuff that he wrote. We have a huge amount of it because one of the things that he liked to do when he was rusticated to his villa or when he was at home in the city was write cod philosophy. He considered himself an eminent observer of history, an eminent observer of trends in history and human nature and reflections on the modern day. That's always lethal. Whenever a professional man of letters, and despite his long public career, Cicero was a professional man of letters, whenever that happens, it's always deadly. Because they're not specialists. And because they don't effectively know what they're talking about. It can be interesting, of course. When a megawatt intellect decides to muse on the subject of tyranny or selflessness, it can be interesting to read, especially if you're an illusion hunter, because they will allude like crazy. They will haul in illusions from all the stuff that they read. That can be interesting to read, whether you're reading about, Gore Vidal's drink-fueled paranoia about the dark state of American diplomacy, or whether or not you're reading about Cicero on, for instance, the nature of the gods. My God, can you imagine it? This is an old Penguin classic translated by H.C.P. McGregor. Or whether you're reading Cicero on government. This is a long treatise on government translated by Michael Grant, the famous populist translator and popular historian of the ancient world, Michael Grant. Then we have On the Good Life. What constitutes the good life? I know probably none of you are getting what I'm talking about here, but this is just lethal. To have a giant, wealthy, overfed gas bag just go on and on about big theological theoretic subjects like this, like what constitutes the good life. Oh my God. Maybe some of you philosophy fans out there will like the sound of this, but oh my God. it's pretty bad. There's enough here to keep even a skeptic like me turning the pages, but it's pretty bad. And this one is translated again by Michael Grant. And then we have slightly more interesting than the others. This is selected political speeches. And you get a sense here of what I'm talking about, right? Because we would kill for this kind of thing from almost any other figure of the ancient world. We know they wrote things like this, but we don't have anything like it. We don't have anything left. Cicero was very careful. That's the man himself. Cicero was very careful about preserving his literary heritage, having it copied. He had people working 24 hours a day, copyists working 24 hours a day, even when he claimed he wasn't going to publish anything. So we have a large body of work. This is selected political speeches. This is also done by Michael Grant. That gets a little more interesting because it gets a little more topical. And that leads us to the next book, which is also a collected Ciceroniana, but which is much more interesting even than the political speeches, and this is the Murder Trials. This is translated by Michael Grant as well, and these are the big speeches that Cicero did in the Roman legal world. You did a big closing speech. It would go on for a very long time, and you wrote it ahead of time. Of course, Cicero wrote it ahead of time, so he had a written record of these things that he could then work on and polish. There's strong evidence to think that the delivered versions of these speeches were not anything like as polished as this, but it doesn't matter. And the Murder Trials, the Penguin Murder Trial volume, like any really good murder trial volume of Cicero's murder speeches will do, introduces you, gives you all the great details of the different trials. So you're not going in blind. And you're also not taking Cicero's word for it. You get as much as we can reconstruct of the events of those trials. Absolutely fascinating. I'm hoping, I haven't actually checked before this video. I should get in the habit of doing that. I haven't actually checked to see the current state of Penguin Classic publishing of Cicero in the present day. I haven't checked to see what is actually available, but I'm sincerely hoping that the Murder Trials at least is one of those volumes. And then the last three things I want to show you here are Penguin Classic mass market volumes, and I don't think they're in print at all. I don't think they're part of that Cicero library, and they are the best things that he wrote. In addition to all of this stuff, long philosophical treatises, political speeches, for and against opponents, for and against himself, courtroom speeches. In addition to all of that, we also have letters that Cicero wrote. He saved and meticulously copied his correspondence throughout his entire life, with a result that is just mind-boggling. We have over 900 letters. That's unbelievable. That's unbelievable what we wouldn't give to have that for Sulla, to have it held for Julius Caesar himself. What? A while ago, Penguin Classics published some volumes of Cicero's letters. They did a 2-volume set, Cicero's Letters to His Friends. These are translated by D.R. Shackleton Bailey, a great Cicero scholar and a great translator. Great notes, great introduction, great context given here. This is a 2-volume set of Cicero's Letters to His Friends. But by far the most famous of those collections was Cicero's Letters to Atticus, a particular friend of his. An enormous volume. This is also Shackleton Bailey, I believe. Yes, it is. An enormous volume of letters back and forth between this one person. And these letters, as far as I know, there's the only other Penguin volume that does the letters is just something called Selected Letters, which is very small. It doesn't give you anywhere near the breadth here. And even this, as you can tell, is not 900 letters. This is carefully curated and abridged. But the great thing about the letters is that Cicero drops as much as he was possible, as much as he was able to do. He drops the arch artificiality that always went hand in hand with his literary expression. He always wrote with posterity looking over his shoulder, so to speak, which is very deadly to prose style. He always did that. Always. Even in grocery store lists. And in his letters, he came the closest to not doing it because he was writing to people who knew him when. And who didn't want him pontificating and stem-winding in private letters. And he was honest enough to keep it that way. There's very little evidence of tinkering after the fact with his letters when he was collecting these things. A lot of these bunches came out posthumously, and I don't get the impression from the text history that he messed around with a lot of them. I think that these things are a testament to what his recipients actually got in the mail, and they are fascinating because they range the whole gamut, from personal life to bad servants to good servants to spectacles that he sees in Roman life. His description of the slaughter of a bunch of African elephants in the amphitheater will leave your blood cold. And he hated it. He hated what he was seeing. That little human moments like that help a lot. Ghost stories, travel stories, these letters are as close as you will get to the man Cicero. Whereas all of the prepared, published stuff, the speeches, God forbid, the political and philosophical tracts, you're as far away from him as you can get. With those, you're looking at a vain and egotistical, posturing intellectual trying to earn a place on Mount Olympus. they're interesting in their own way for that. But by far the best thing to read, if you're going to read any Cicero, by far the best thing to read is his letters. And once again, we finished this Daily Penguin with a call on my part that it will never be answered, of course. But what I wouldn't give, you can see over my shoulder some of those enormous 1,500-page Penguin classics. What I wouldn't give for an enormous 1,500-page Penguin classic of Cicero's letters. I'd be willing to bet that in a volume like that, you could get almost all of them. If you controlled your footnoting and your narrative apparatus, I bet you could get almost all of his surviving letters in one volume. And how fascinating a volume would that be? It brings the ancient world to life like nobody else. All the major participants of his life, of his age, are in these letters, or are referenced as living people that you can bump elbows with in the forum. That's invaluable, and it's also great reading. And what I wouldn't give for Penguin to do that, instead of coming out with their 8 millionth paperback edition of War and Peace. But one way or another, that's your Daily Penguin for today. It is, in fact, let's see his face again. It is, in fact, Cicero, the Roman orator, whose acquaintance you should make, but I want to warn you that outside of the collections of his letters, he can be a bit of a bore, as he was in life. So I just want to warn you about that. We have an absolute smorgasbord of literary remains from him, unlike so many people that we've encountered and will encounter. But sometimes more isn't better. So I imagine he wrote a philosophical treatise on that at some point or other. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, and we'll move on to the next Penguin soon. Thank you, BookTube.